Good evening. It's Wednesday, so I thought we should do something suitably Odinic. Therefore, on the world spear of the Sky Father, Trishula, Gungnir, Pinaka. One of the most iconic identifying attributes of the Indo-European Sky Father deific is his spear. Whether Gungnir of Odin, the Trishula of Mahadeva, or the javelin-like Thunderbolt of Zeus / Jupiter, interestingly frequently depicted as a three-pronged thunderbolt, as soon as we think of these deific expressions, the weapon is never far from his hand. Indeed, Shulapani, which is to say bearing the spear in his hand, is literally a Shaivite theonym. Gungnir's Vafadar, meanwhile, we could perhaps slightly figuratively translate as Shakes spear. There are other forms with which this weapon may take as well. Sometimes it is a staff, particularly in the hands of the wanderer, as, for example, the Gand of Gandalf. On other occasions, we see it manifested as something more exotic, like Hades' Bident, or Poseidon's Trident, Dionysus Thyrsus, or even the scythe of Kronos, when it is not being an adamantium harpe, perhaps. The oft-wooden, or woden, sacrificial post of the Indo-Europeans, an Urmansul, or a Yupastamba, or a sheafling for that matter, but then I repeat myself thrice, is also relevant here. Continuing with the spear associations, it may be represented as a lance or a pennant affixed pole borne by a rider. The caduceus and or rod of Asclepius may form yet a further example, as the Windwalker deific is strongly coterminous with the Sky Father, and the healing portfolio likewise. Although perhaps the best known further form for this device in the Hindu sphere is one which is far less frequently thought of, in its connection amidst the Western Indo-Europeans: the bow and arrows, as wielded by Shiva Rudra. Now this may seem a bit of an overextension of the concept. After all, a staff or a spear is a single length of wood, and while a spear can be thrown, and in the case of Odin's spear quite prominently is, the form and function of shooting a bow and its arrows seem somehow quite different to this, except that this is a surprisingly misleading skein of myth interpretation. Consider what a bow actually is. It, too, is a single length of wood. Consider the manner and the mechanism in which it exerts force through the propelling of a sharp, piercing length of wood through the air. And then consider one of the most resonant of the traditional names for Shiva Rudra's bow, Pinaka, derived from Proto-Indo-European pine or pene, which means a length of wood or a staff. It means a bow, a staff, a spear, and especially, quite pointedly, those of Shiva. So quite clearly, in the Vedic conceptual syllabary, there was not really much of an issue to be had with that same stave of wood, doing effective double duty as both spear and bow. But what is this device really? Why is it that the symbolism of a single length of wood is so powerful and so resonant as to survive for thousands of years across seemingly almost the entire Indo-European sphere? Albeit, it should be noted, with various of the cosmological attributes that I am about to explicate being found only directly attested in the Hindu understanding, and then extrapolated out by me therefrom to the non-Hindu examples of the sphere. The spear, I should say. Although, as we shall see, that too is a bit of a repetition. In line with the otherwise strong concordance of these non-Hindu divine weapons, with the underlying typology in other areas, and in a manner which, to my mind at least, most cohesively establishes their thematic unity. Well, in order to answer that, we must go back to the bow, more specifically Brihaspati's bow, Brihaspati, as should be well known by now for those of us who follow our work, we regard as another aspect or form of Shiva, another face of the Sky Father. His weapon is quite remarkable, in that it is said that the bowstring for it is Rudra, that is to say cosmic order, itself, made manifest as a pillar or a beam which runs between the 2 points at the end of his bow stave. Why it is a shaft? It is because, much like Shiva as Lingod Baba, that is to say Shiva in his infinite form as one of these posts, it is in effect Brahman, the Absolute, intersecting with our reality. It is rather like if you were to imagine yourself a two-dimensional being on a two-dimensional plane, encountering something three-dimensional, which intersected with your world. You should only be able to perceive it as a line in front of you, its length fluctuating commensurate with whatever width the part of the three-dimensional object in question intersecting with your reality possessed. And now simply scale that analogy up to our three spatial dimensions, and consider that the Rudra, the bowstring of Brihaspati, is an intersection from beyond dimensions, and you can see why it may make sense to represent it as a line, particularly when the bow stave itself can represent the curvature, the extent of the universe. Hence my oft-quoted expression that the long arc of the universe does indeed bend toward justice, for justice is the bowstring, and said long arch is the arch and archer, a bow, wielded by the great god himself. The humkara twang of the bowstring being an in-universe reverberation, or, I suppose, emanation of Rudra, that is therefore the sonorous expression of Dharma itself. Yet how does a bowstring relate to a spear? Well, once again, the weapons of Lord Shiva hold the key. Consider the Trishula. What is it? Literally translated, it would be 3-point, or 3-spear, head trident, is the Western equivalent. For that is most certainly the shape, although dent means teeth. There's a DT sound shift going on there. And customarily affixed to it, we find the damaru, Shiva's drum, the dagad 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 sound of which being generated even to this day, when the damaru upon a spear is utilized by Shaivite worshippers, by rapidly turning the spear's shaft back and forth so that the small core-attached beaters strike the surface of the drum skin rapidly and in regular rhythmic succession. The damaru affixed to Shiva's Trishula is rotated in such a way to produce the sounds, the rhythm which regulates the universe's dance entire. So what does this mean? Well, it positions the Trishula as being quite literally at the center of everything, of the great pattern that is our universe. It is, in other words, the Axis Mundi, and its wielder is the true Chakravartin, the one whose wheel is in motion according to his souterrain design. The wheel here, of course, being the worlds, and drawing from the well-attested Vedic cosmology, wherein the Axis Mundi is a chariot axle, also occasionally, even in the same breath, is said to be akin to a tree, with the spokes of the wheels being like the tree's branches. A world tree, you might say. And the motion being the unfolding of his plan, his design, his script. This is a rather direct rendering of the relevant Sanskrit concept, in which all the world's a stage, as a certain spear shaker put it. It is taken rather directly as the model for the great god and goddess's immanency in the universe as both actors and scriptwriters and starring directors of the cosmic play. The regular turning of said wheel and its speed is the fundamental progression on through the ongoing cycles of time. So now we are starting to see just why it is that the spear, or staff, or bowstring, is such an enduring emblem of the Sky Father. It is precisely because the Sky Father is Ishvara, the God Emperor, as we would say in Sanskrit, who rules the universe entire under his mighty Samrajya, Imperium, although more literally it means same rule, as in same rule everywhere. Although also even rule, or fair rule, or just rule would be acceptable translations. He who holds the physical reification of the cosmic law in his mighty hands, and who can and will, entirely uncoincidentally, strike down with great vengeance and furious ugra those who would poison and destroy the dominion of the Devarajya. Vengeance here also being meant to stand for its Proto-Indo-European etymological root, dek, which means to point out. And other than being a fine pun for the spear's fundamental characteristic of employment, also comes to refer to pointing out what is righteous and just. Hence, ancient Greek dikaiosuné, which means righteousness or justice. I suppose that which is pointed out. And of course, which gives us Latin-derived terms like dictator, vindicate, as well as the English, teach. Exactly how the law is made use of, even outside of a sacral politico, mytho-cosmological sense. The Shula in Trishula is also interesting, on a brief aside, for another reason, as not only does the term pointedly refer to a sharpness which helps to inform its usage, also as a designation for the punishment of a dire criminal via his impalement thereupon, the immanentization of justice once again, but can also refer to a particularly steep mountain. A mountain, of course, being the major mechanism via which Indo-European mythology treats the expression of the Axis Mundi concept, and which also has considerable overlap, also, with each of the tree and goddess that are also thought of as this concept. This threefold coterminity we can demonstrate in both linguistic and mythological terms, as I did in the course of Bharat Mata and the Indo-European deific of national identity, a previous work of mine. This may also have some comparative saliency for the three as terms in Old Norse, which, despite notionally diverged speculative etymologies, effectively converge in terms of their meaning fields. One, the most prominent, being the Ansus, and thence Aesir, related designation for a god, and in terms of the Os of the Icelandic Yngafutarak rune poem, referring to Odin quite specifically. The underlying Indo-European etymological sense for this as, effectively meaning sire, although it should be noted that in the Nordic mythology, Odin is not technically the king, due in part due to the relatively different mythopolitical arrangements prevalent therein. The other meaning, various sorts of wooden beams upon which something is dependent, such as the yard affixed to the mast of a ship from which the sail is hung, or the main beam of a house, including, in more recent times, the axle of a wheel. And the third, referring to a ridgeline. These terms have remained remarkably phonetically close to the point of overt overlap in the Nordic languages since. Yet that is not the point that I had intended to make, which is much simpler. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. The Proto-Indo-European underpinning for Sanskrit shula is ke, which means sharp or sharpen, which also gives us the ancient Greek konos, which is exceptionally relevant for our purposes due to what this term means, in addition to its rather obvious generalized sense of a cone shape. A pine cone, and for that matter the pine tree from which these descend. Although it should be noted that modern English pine is, in theory, from another Proto-Indo-European root altogether, thus rendering its phonetic similarity to Proto-Indo-European pine a case of convergent re-evolution and re-emergence. Why I am gesticulating enthusiastically about pine cones? Because the thyrsus of Dionysus is a staff that has been tipped with a pine cone. This renders it simultaneously a spear, yet also a device wherein the spear head is comprised of a symbol of life and ensuing growth to soon begin. As I had briefly made mention of earlier, the Old Norse Aeth of Aether, which is cognate with archaic Vedic Athuria, which should not be confused with the later Athura, which means non or anti-shining, non or anti-light. This Athura, Aether, carries forward an Indo-European concept for a powerful, mighty figure with a progenitive element. Hence my rendering of it as sire, to recall both the kingly and fatherly senses of the term, and hence also the latter's direct relevancy when it comes to the pine cone spearhead of Dionysus. The thyrsus element also links to the Scythians, as can be attested by the repeated occurrence of it in regal names, both mythic and semi-historical. Most prominently, both kings named Thyrsus, which is largely what we should expect, given the strong associations of Scythia with Dionysus in the Greek imagination, as well as the strongly plausible linkages of the Scythian culture and religious customs to the relevant Indo-European deific complex, i.e. Shiva, Odin, Rudra, Vayuvata, as I have discussed in several previous works, and which include, for our purposes here, the skew etymology of Scythian, which effectively means to shoot, to skewer, to spear, as the great god on horseback, or, for that matter, riding a bull, or an antlered vahana that is swift as the wind, or even in some cases a chariot, is well known to do. All of which helps to illustrate the rather close adherence of the Scythians to the archaic Indo-European mytho-cultural norms, in a manner which can be fairly said to be carrying on the ways of the ancestors as a sort of living wild hunt or ghost division. Figures of myth, acting in reified resonancy with the greater myth, the greater reality of our ultimate divine origins. But I have digressed, and rather widely and wildly at that. To bring it back to the Trishula itself, the customary Hindu explication of its symbolism is that the 3 points to the spear symbolize various sets of 3 qualities or concepts that all together connote, well, pretty much all and everything. So, for example, the 3 gunas, the qualities or energies, the 3 worlds, the 3 actions of creation, preservation, and destruction, and therefore that the Trishula represents the universe under the dominion of its wielder, as well as implicitly the power to end said universe via his command and complete control of each of the major forces therein which allow it to keep existing, or to begin to be existing in the first place. Our Spear of the World Axis concept is further strengthened via the Skanda Purana's identification of Mount Meru, just such an Axis Mundi, as having 3 peaks, each of which is also keyed to the one of the Trimurti, and therefore their respective energetic and portfolio associations. It may also be possible to triangulate an additional support for this in the Western Indo-European mythologies, if we consider the confluence of the Nordic world tree Yggdrasil as an ash, and the well-renowned usage of the ash tree for spear crafting. This turns up in Old English, wherein aisk, that is to say ash tree, is a kenning for spear, as well as being the name for the Anglo-Saxon iteration of the Ansus rune. It is also seriously prominent in Greek custom and mythology. For example, the famed spear of Peleus, as produced by C.A.R, Hephaestus and Athena, and wielded to such great effect by Peleus' son Achilles, to the point that they appeared to have had such a specific adjective relating to the ash usage in question, eumeles, good ash, in reference to the prominent man's spar. Entirely uncoincidentally, to my mind anyway, we also find Poseidon appearing in relation to this as well, being romantically linked to the nymph Melia, ash tree, which echoes the pattern we have established elsewhere of the Sky Father deific, and yes, Poseidon is one. See my previous works such as Swear by the Sea, Swear by the Stars, Swear by the Sky, on the mytholinguistics of Varuna, Neptune, Uranus, for instance, and remember that for the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the sky was also a kind of sea. The Sky Father having a female partner that is closely aligned with the element which comprises the world spear. So Shiva's Parvati mountain, in relation to the world's mountain as Trishula, Brihaspati's Vash, which means sacred speech, and regarded as an in-universe expression of Rita herself, also specifically identified in Rigveda Mandala 10, hymn 125, the famed Devi Sukta, as being the force which makes Rudra's bow work. The bending, which turns it from a stave into an arch, presumably by acting as the bowstring, and thus producing the sacred humkara sound, which can also mean a bowstring's twang as it happens, when this is fired. In relation to the bow and Rita bowstring, the both mountain and tree symbolism of Odin's partner, and so on and so forth. The direct mention of Yggdrasil providing the wood which forms Gungnir, I have regrettably not been able to track down much further than Wagner, who despite his undeniable enthusiasm and potent inspiration, is not exactly a primary nor authoritative and authentic source. But off the basis of the above evidence, it would seem to be a fairly reasonable and plausible continuation of the typology. So to bring it all back to the central shaft, what does all of this mean? Why is it that the Sky Father is so irreducibly associated with a spear, a weapon? Well, leaving aside the fact that this does not always appear as a weapon, see if the earlier points of commentary around the sacrificial post, for example, the triple saliency is quite clear. First and foremost, the spear is a power. In its way, this is expressed as the power of existence, rulership, and its cessation, death, and therefore is the emblem of the Sky Father's regal authority and command over the cosmos. It is the universe and its model. Hence, it is the Sky Father's potency, as it is the universe in his hands, working to his purpose. And yet it is also something much more than that, which also underpins and undergirds the Devarajya itself, namely, cosmic law made manifest. Hence also the Damaru, via which the law's regulation of the cosmos is symbolized most directly. The universe dances to the beat of its drum. A most mighty thing for a ruler to have at his side, and hence why none can stand against the weapon in question when it is wielded, and none can truly escape it when it is thrown, fired, or shot. It appears that as a weapon, in no small part, because that is what, in a certain ultimate sense, we tend to acknowledge as being authority. Although I have repeatedly noted, in other texts or other verses of the various Indo-European religions, it also appears as other vitally important elements, which convey a similar saliency in their own respective realms. The sacrificial post, around which the religion is formed and practiced, the Axis Mundi, around which the universe rotates and is fundamentally organized, the goddess, around which so much of all of the above is subtly orientated. And this also has some interesting implications for the ash tree as an origin point for man, as well in certain Indo-European mythologies. If the Sky Father holds the whole world in his hands, as the song goes, it only makes sense for its prime apparition to be as a weapon. For as we have already repeatedly demonstrated, the Indo-European conception of the cosmos is that its fundamental essence and expression is through war. See on the Mytholinguistics of War Part 1, as you can probably guess by the title. In particular, the portions on the subsequent derivations of orolog-like terms in Germanic and the meaning of Bhutatman in Sanskrit. The world spear is, in short, the greatest of weapons, the greatest of spears, for the greatest of worlds, namely, the one watched over by the wise and piercing gaze of the Sky Father, in both defense of the immanency of cosmic order, that is to say, Rita, Orlog, the Chaos Unia therein, as well as wielding said order's immanency as the most keen-in weapon possible. Whether it is encountered as the spear, the bident, the trident, the bow and arrow, the staff of the wanderer, the world mountain, the world tree, the sacral pillar, or some other and yet more exotic form besides, the world spear forms both the greatest weapon and the greatest refuge for our values. It is therefore only enduringly apt that the spear forms the emblematic ensign for the Sky Father in so many forms across so many descendant Indo-European mytho-cultures. And it is also, therefore, only appropriate that we seek to illuminate this shared heritage upon a Wednesday, Woden's Day, in this particular month. Jai Ishvara, Jai Shulapani, Hail Gertir, victory to the spear god. We are all but the mighty weapon in his hands.